Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for the second ever Brains Blog Roundtable. My name is Dan Bernstein, and I'm the co-managing editor of the Brains Blog, along with Nick Bird. And what we're doing in these roundtable sessions is we are trying to bring together high-level researchers from distinct topics in philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology, and try to kind of get them together for a talk about where they see the state of the field, what's inspiring them about the research that they're doing, and also sort of prognosticate a little bit about where the field is headed in the future. So today is very exciting. It's our first ever co-hosted roundtable. We're co-hosting between us at the Brains Blog and P-Soup. So I'm very happy to introduce my P-Soup representing co-host today, Dave Shoemaker, who is a professor in the Sage School of Philosophy at Cornell University. He's also the author of the 2015 book, Responsibility from the Margins, and is currently working on a book on humor. He's also the organizer of the long-running New Orleans workshop on agency and responsibility, and the attendant Oxford series on what's called the Oxford Studies of Agency and Responsibility, I believe. And that's very apposite for today, because today our topic is agency. So agency, in many ways, is one of the oldest philosophical questions, the question of what it is to be an agent, what it is to be the author of one's actions, as opposed to simply a passive participant in them. What are the aspects of the mind and action for which we can hold individuals accountable? So this obviously has a long connection to issues in free will and moral responsibility, but also issues in how we think about the self. And even more recently, issues how we think about the responsibility of collectives, like, say, political parties or businesses, how we might hold them accountable for their actions. So it's an old question, but also a new question. And one of the things that's most exciting about it, for me at least, is that advances in neuroscience and psychology over the last couple of decades have really started to, in my view, make major inroads in telling us about the causal factors underlying our actions, why we act the way we do, how we conceptualize our actions, and so forth. So that's the topic for today. I'm very excited to have a really cool panel here today with a bunch of folks doing really interesting stuff. So I'm going to introduce them really quickly and then ask them to go through their work. I went alphabetical order last time, so I guess I'll go cross alphabetical order this time. So our first panelist today is Robin Waller, who is an assistant professor of philosophy at Iona College and is co-directing. They're building a neuroscience program there, if I understand correctly, and she is co-managing that, so that's really exciting. She's published in a number of areas in philosophy, including specifically of interest to me, the relevance of neuroscience for free will, but also on compatibilism. She's done some experimental philosophy, and recently a paper that I've read and am planning to read again on the search for neural correlates of decision and intention, which is very exciting to me. And she's begun work on a book project on an up-to-date version of compatibilism. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Great. So we'll have you say more about that in just a second. So thanks so much, Robin, for being here. I want to introduce next Chandra Chapada, who is an associate professor in both the philosophy program and the psychiatry department at the University of Michigan. Chandra's work is, he's someone who really spans both empirical and philosophical styles of analysis and is really doing both of those, which I always admire because I find just philosophy to be hard enough. But Chandra works in neuroscience with fMRI methods, has done work in experimental philosophy, and has also written a number of philosophy articles in very prestigious philosophy journals, including a recent piece, which I haven't read yet, but is on the top of my list, The Atoms of Self-Control in Nous. And he's also the co-author of a book on perspective human reasoning with some very esteemed co-authors called Homo Prospectus from a couple of years ago. So very excited to have you, Chandra. Thanks so much for being here. And then last but certainly not least, John Doris is the Peter L. Dyson Professor of Ethics and Organizations, Ethics in Organizations and Life at Cornell University, and also a professor in the Sage School of Philosophy there. John's done very influential work in agency, moral responsibility, specifically surrounding the notion of character. So John's 2002 book, Lack of Character, I spent, even as a non-ethics student, I read it in graduate school and really enjoyed it at the time. But also the more recent 2015 book, Talking to Ourselves, Reflection, Ignorance, and Agency, and also John, a forthcoming collection of essays. Is that right? Also coming out with Oxford. And John's also, I happen to have read a chapter working on a book on the replication crisis in psychology with Edouard Machery at Pittsburgh. So I'm very, very excited for that to come out as well. So thanks all of you for being here. I'm really, really excited about the discussion today. Looking forward to diving into it. What I want to start with is asking each of you to just spend a couple of minutes telling us about your current research project. So what are you excited about right now? What are you working on? And also, if you can, a little bit about sort of why you think that's an important project to be working on right now. So Robin, do you mind getting us started? Got to unmute yourself though. Yeah, there you go.
Of course. Yeah, sure. So I hadn't planned to say much about the book project, but I'll say something briefly about it and then I'll move on. I'm working on a book proposal about compatibilism, and it's a sort of new account of compatibilism that takes seriously the sourcehood and the ability to do otherwise requirements. Ties it in with stuff like manipulation, and also I'm hoping to bring in a bit about why being a candidate for the responsibility practices is an important part of personhood and life, and why we should take seriously moral responsibility and not be skeptics. But I love that project. But instead, I think I'm going to say something about my research in philosophy of neuroscience, if that's cool. So obviously it concerns agency, especially the bearing of cognitive neuroscience on what I take to be meaningful agency. So by meaningful, I usually mean something like decisions and actions that are up to me, freely done, morally appraisable. So I used to focus a lot on the Libet paradigms. Recently, I've kind of broadened the scope, and I'm looking to focus on naturalistic neuroscientific paradigms of voluntary and free agency and the implications of this for our understanding of agents and free will. So I've got two collaborative projects running right now on this kind of note. One is with a military neuroscientist, Major Alison Brigger, formerly of the Walter Reed Institute, and we're working on sleep deprivation and how this impacts sense of agency. So we're understanding that with the intentional binding paradigm and initiation of agency. And we're taking this to be important because there is, of course, this practical question of the daily functioning of this large segment of society, subjects often non-culpably to sleep deprivation, and often having to make decisions quickly in moral context or high stakes contexts. So, this idea of how sense of agency changes under sleep deprivation is relevant for those contexts. I also find it fascinating from a theoretical perspective in terms of when we ascribe control and responsibility to people for their actions. If those actions are done under sleep deprivation, should we mitigate responsibility, or should we excuse them, and when and in what conditions? So the other one I'll say just a bit about is a collaborative project with Elizabeth Pars-Pulares, who's a postdoctoral researcher at Trinity College Dublin. And they were focusing on how the neuroscience of free will often talks about these sort of spontaneous simple actions, so the Libet cases, but we think there should be more of a focus on decision-making in uncertainty or in dynamic contexts. So to this end, we're collaborating on some paradigms where people make decisions when there's changing exogenous evidence in the environment, or when people are acting in a dynamic environment. So when action execution is difficult or is perturbed. And we take these paradigms to tell us something further about the neural realizers of intention, which is the project you had alluded to earlier. And we take this to offer us more information about the shape of human agency beyond the simpler paradigms.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks so much. There's a lot to dive in there, and we'll come back to certainly some of the issues with collaboration and so forth as we dive in today. Great. I guess Chandra, do you want to go next?
Sure. So first of all, thank you, Dan and Dave, for hosting. Very glad to be here. two topics I'm spending most all my time these days on. The first is automaticity and control. And you're thinking, oh, that old topic again? And it has been studied extensively in philosophy. But the automaticity, the mind unfolding spontaneously, and control, the way that the spontaneous states get supervised and regulated. There's still a lot of juice in this lemon, I believe. I have a picture of agency that is emerging that situates the automatic and control distinction at the level of the micro scale. What does that mean? It's take any temporally extended patch of thought or mentation, like deliberation or the stream of consciousness. I claim that it can be broken down into little doings, little units. And there are computational models that help us understand what goes on at the level of those individual units. And at those units, there's an interplay of automaticity and control. And it's a interesting vantage point to look at agency. And it's one that actually has strong resonance with the Buddhist and the Stoic philosophy of mind. So that's one theme, and I'll say one more. And it's closely related. It's the idea of distortion. So what is that? Aaron Beck in the early 60s was visiting psychiatric wards. He was a classically trained analyst, and he didn't hear Freudian material. What he heard was what he described as distorted automatic thoughts. And what he was characterizing is negativity, bias, and depression. And so distortions are features of one's mind in virtue of which the individual is forming inappropriate impressions. The impressions are examples of these little units that I characterized earlier. Impressions are fast and automatic tokenings of belief states about the current situation. And he found that these impressions were colored in very characteristic ways in these individuals. That notion of a distortion turns out to be very powerful. And I claim that if you're looking at psychiatry and the different kinds of symptoms and the different kinds of disorders, whether it's paranoia and schizophrenia, or whether it's negativity, bias, and depression, or threat sensitivity and anxiety, or value hypertrophy and addiction, what you're talking about is just distortion manifesting in different ways. And so you can see how this starts to be relevant to agency and responsibility and so forth. So those are a couple of themes I'm working on.
Awesome, really, really cool. Yeah, thanks. And we'll definitely dive back into, I'm really interested to hear more about the connection between these automatic thought patterns and agency. So we'll definitely come back to that. So John, can you go ahead? You can tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days?
Yeah, I didn't get into thinking about agency in a very agential way. I was puzzled about some results in psychology that seemed to suggest that people could often be brought to do things for sort of goofy non-reasons. And if that was true, it seemed like it wanted explaining, and that compelled me, as it were, to think about agency. And so that's what I did in talking to ourselves. And then as that was happening, it was starting to turn out that the problematic psychology had problems of its own. And that got me thinking about issues in meta science and replication and so on, and which has led to this idea of this project with Mashery. And at the same time, I ended up being convinced that the fight about how important character was in our lives is really a fight about effect sizes. And so I decided I wanted to understand what was going on with effect sizes, and that's meta science too. So that's mostly what I've been doing, but coming to a business school, I'm doing some more applied empirical research, and some of this does bear on agency. So I've always had the suspicion that notions of agency were importantly ideological. And very early in my career, I had the idea that the value placed on agency might have a lot to do with socioeconomic status. The thought roughly being that you worry about agency after you've bought the groceries. In fact, it turns out that interest in or valuing agency actually looks to be pretty widespread. It's not just a Western artifact. If you look at the stuff about what's called internal locus of control, it looks like that's the thing people get. They want what authorship, we're going to have lots of sophisticated talk about different ways to make this out, but people do want to think they're steering their own ship. But there's another kind of sense where you can think of agency as ideological, and that's as agent talk as an instrument of social control. And what I've been thinking about with Laura Nemi and some folks in her lab here at Cornell, and Christian Smith-Crow, who's at the BU Business School, is how making agency salient impacts behavior. So it's, again, these are business school people. So the context is workplace misconduct. You work in a call center and you have a horrible customer. Do you hang up or do you patiently help them? So just call it the dependent variable, sabotage. Okay. And then independent variables, do you tell the subjects to judge according to their own internal moral compass, how they should behave, or or is there a set of rules and you tell them they must conform to the rules? Now, like my colleague Sean Nichols, I'm a rules guy, so I voted for rules, and Laura thought it was the moral compass. And so far, what we're finding is that I'm right and people behave better in terms of refraining from negative behavior and producing positive behavior if what's made salient is not their internal control, but the external rules. And so, but however that turns out, Laura could still be right, I could still be wrong. It's agency, not quite so much, it's moral psychology, but it's agency talk as a means of control, external control.
Yeah, cool. So that's really, 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 really rich, thinking about internal versus external loci of control. And I really like the applied focus of the research as well. So that's also something I want to bring up as we go along. Dave, do you want to hop in and tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days?
Sure, although I'd rather hear from the others because there's lots of fascinating stuff going on. But I've been interested in mostly responsibility issues and from the normative side of the map, so less about the metaphysics of free will and how that pertains to responsibility than about our practices of holding one another to account and what might render those fitting or appropriate or morally permissible or obligatory, etc. And so in recent years, I've been interested in self-directed versions. So self-blame has become quite hot amongst a few folks, and I'm interested in pursuing some ideas there. In particular, how self-blame is actually quite different from asymmetrical cases of other blame. I think that's the wrong way to think of it, that in fact, guilt is the response to blame, but in a self-directed form, it's anger, just like it is in the other directed case. So those are kind of symmetrical, but the kind of anger is quite different. That anger directed at other people, it's moral in character, it's for slights to them and theirs, and it's got a motivation to confront, and often it's retributive. Whereas in the self-directed case, it's really about blocking your goals, the kind of goal frustration, anger. You prevented yourself from doing something that you wanted to do. And so it has much in common with what psychologists call self-talk, which has found to have dramatically positive results for athletes, for example, where they, in the positive case, they say, you're doing great, just 5 more reps, that kind of thing, that kind of positive self-talk is really dramatically effective. but also in the negative version. So when Serena Williams slams that racket down, I mean, that's just classic kind of self-blame. It's anger, but it's an anger of a frustrated, what, you idiot, what are you thinking? That kind of thing. And so it's different from the other directed case. So that's one kind of research. I'm also interested in ways in which, and I'm writing a book, because you mentioned on humor and morality, and so ways in which there are aspects of humor that are analogous or that are enlightening when we think about our interpersonal moral practices. And so we find out, for example, from narcissists who have a terrible sense of humor, but that there's a kind of blame that they're incapable of appreciating, understanding, and that's that kind of angry, other-directed, confrontational kind of thing, which is demanding a kind of empathy. They're not capable of that, but they are capable of what I think is another kind of blame, which has been completely unappreciated, which is mocking. And so it doesn't have all the features that this kind of regular angry blame does. It doesn't implicate desert. It doesn't implicate, the ability to do otherwise, none of that. But it has a very powerful corrective function. And so that's the kind of interchange that I'm interested in, is ways in which humor can actually inform our sense of morality, but also agency and responsibility.
Awesome, great, thanks so much. So I'm already worried we're not gonna get to all the interesting material that there is here today, but we'll do our best. So I think I want to start out with a question that maybe is a little bit polemical. So each of you, in your own ways, I think, have expressed, the need to engage with other disciplines, or the need to seek sort of broader avenues for thinking about agency. So I want to actually start by asking, there's a series of kind of standard views of agency in philosophy. So one of them is bound up in action theory. So one is an agent if their actions are caused in the right way by their reasons or their attitudes. But there's also hierarchical theories that say, you're an agent if you rationally endorse the motivations that drive your behavior. Or in a more sort of Kantian flavor, agency is the exercise of a rational will. So this is just a small sampling of ideas that I'm familiar with as sort of a general philosophy person. Do these ideas still guide your work at all? Do they have any relevance in what you're thinking about in these more applied or interdisciplinary contexts? How should we think about these sort of traditional philosophical dialectics with regards to the kind of work that you find interesting to do right now? So actually, Chandra, do you mind getting us started on this? Because you, as someone who's doing the neuroscience as well, I'd be specifically interested in starting with your perspective on it.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to criticize or impugn any of the models that you put out. I mean, there is no model that is good for all purposes. I think, models have limitations, and they highlight certain features, and there are other features that they elide and make it challenging to identify. I do note, though, that a lot of contemporary models of agency take a very, what you might call a time slice perspective, or a static perspective, and they ask structural features of the agent at a particular moment and ask questions about agency that flow from that. The traditional belief desire model has that kind of feature, explanatory pattern. And so I'm going to go back to the example of Aaron Beck and the distorted automatic thoughts, because I think it's just thinking about that kind of case reveals so much. So what is his claim? His claim is the individual who is vulnerable to depression. So the professor has an ambiguous face, and they interpret that as that he doesn't like me, or a grade kind of feedback is given, and then they think, well, I'm going to fail. And these kind of interpretive events are going on all the time as you're transacting with the environment, and even in the stream of thought. And there's an interplay of automaticity, and there's limitations on control. These events are not particularly salient. Okay, that's a picture of agency. It actually has a strong anchoring in some traditional frameworks like the Buddhist and Stoic. It's hard to squeeze that in to any of the models that you put. And so I would just advocate, let's put a lot of models on the table and that highlight different features of agency for different purposes. And one of them that we should be thinking about more is this kind of Buddhist Stoic CBT kind of model.
Yeah, cool. Maybe Robin, do you want to go next? Because I mean, the literature you mentioned about sort of finding the correlates of intention and decision in the brain, I've always kind of interpreted that as being a kind of causal theory, right? You want to find the causally preceding parts, and then the downstream effects of those.
Yeah. Well, if we had more time, I would love to talk more about CBT, because I've sort of got stuff to say about that and how it connects to agency. But I will talk about this. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, so I'll say something though about this standard model intentional action, because that does really nicely connect, as you mentioned, with the neural realizers of intention, and we find them using these experiments. So at least for me, the standard model of intentional action, it very much informs my work on the nature of intention and how we're going to operationalize intention for neuroscience. So recently, I used just basic points about the role of intention in action production that philosophers have put out over the last 50 plus years. I kind of came up with this operationalization of intention we could use when we look for neural realizers of intention. And I think one of the things that you get out of it that's sort of overlooked is when we look at like limbic context and these simple spontaneous actions, we're thinking mostly of, intention formation when there's no reason to do something, when you're not really uncertain about what to do beyond that it's arbitrary, when the action is easy to carry out if it's a button press or something like that. But what I think the standard model brings to the table is we can talk about the roles of intention both prospectively, so in planning, and then the roles of intention in action execution. And for instance, right, one of the things that a causalist will say is that intentions don't just initiate action, right, or cause action or kick it off, but also they sustain and guide action. And you get that out of those threats from causal deviance and Davidson's climber and stuff. So if you think of intention as seriously playing a role in sustaining and guiding action, that actually recommends that as philosophers and neuroscientists interested in action, we ought to be looking at these neuroscientific paradigms where people are acting in uncertainty. So they're carrying out a complex action, the environment is changing, and so you've got this changing exogenous evidence about what you need to do in real time. And there you can really get a good sense of which sort of brain areas and which networks are involved in guiding and sustaining action. So I actually think the standard model, even though it's sort of an old point of discussion, can help us move forward in the shape of agency using neuroscience. You're
See, now I'm doing it. Yeah, that's really helpful, and I think it's a nice confluence of ways of thinking in the different in philosophy and in the sciences. John, I really also want to hear you weigh in on this too, because in some ways I've often thought of your work as sort of pointing out the external circumstances, the situational factors, the contextual factors that are guiding our behavior. And I've always thought that to some degree these are not necessarily well captured by the kinds of models that I laid out. Is that your reading on it, or how do you think about it?
Yeah. So in the first instance, I'm with Chandra, and I'm a pluralist, right? And it may very well be that we need different accounts of agency. Now, of course, we don't expect the actual participants in the relationship, but an intimate relationship might require thinking about, tacitly at least, about responsibility in a different way than a civil relationship, and so on. And my guess is this is going to be a theme, but I tend to the extent my colleagues are going a level down, I find myself wanting to go a level up, right, and think about the social. So here's a old idea that seems to me to be extraordinarily influential still, and that's the reactive attitudes, right, and including for naturalistically inclined interdisciplinary philosophers like me, and we thought the reactive attitudes was a way to get things on the cheap, the metaphysical cheap that we needed, never mind what Strawson's notoriously obscure article says. But this seems like a very appealing idea. But now take that ideology thought. I recently had a chance to do a reaction for Miss Curia's new book, An Intersectional Feminist Theory of Responsibility. And one of the things I got out of that was that which it just never occurred to me. It's remarkable, but everybody notices different things. But when I have a reactive attitude, probably it's usually implicitly, but sometimes it's explicit. I'm claiming standing, right? Or I would upon a cross-examination or whatever. I'm claiming standing to be angry at Chandra, right? Or whatever it is. And then we're back to power dynamics, right? And lots of kind of stuff. And I think there's a million ways in which many people, and I'm as guilty as anyone who has taken on this old idea pretty uncritically, there's many things that we haven't thought about enough, given how much work that model is expected to do. But one kind of thing that we really haven't thought about enough is how to think about that in terms of power dynamics and the way they attach to social categories and so on and so forth. And so I think there's a still incredibly influential old idea that is surprisingly underworked.
Follow up here, Dan. I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
I mean, one threat of pluralism is that you start talking about plural objects. And so I'm wondering if you have, and I don't think there is, a unified understanding here of what the object of investigation is. That is, what's agency? I mean, it's sounding like intentional creatures for Robin, and it's sounding like something else for Chandra, and it's sounding like something else, subject of social dynamics, for John. And I'm wondering if you have a kind of unified understanding of what the topic is. John said,
I think we should be pluralist all the way down, right? So it does. I don't think it has to be. So there's a sense in which the talk agent responsibility is systematically ambiguous, but I don't think it has to be misleadingly systematically ambiguous, as long as we're clear on what we're tagging in different contexts, and what use we're putting it to. This is, as soon as you said plural objects, I got worried. I didn't know what a plural object was, but now I understand what you're talking about. So I'm not the guy to ask. There's lots of stuff in the philosophy of language, but it seems like we, for example, quite seamlessly use friend to pick out many different kinds of relationship. When I say my friend, how are you today, my friend, to the butcher, and no one's mysterious. He doesn't then say, cool, we're friends. Can I borrow $100? Right. So it doesn't seem, maybe you could say more, but it's not obvious to me that the plural objects has to spell disaster.
Yeah, Robin, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say, definitely when I'm, if I'm speaking about like neuroscientific paradigms, I'm going to focus on the intentional agent, but I would agree that I'd be a pluralist insofar as if I'm talking about agency qua responsible agent, I'm going to want to bring in that social dynamic piece as well. And Mitch Kara's works, that's one of the ones that I'll go to. But, that idea of social dynamics and reactive attitudes, that's going to be part of that piece for me. So I guess it depends on the level or the approach you're using. But insofar as that's what a pluralist is, I would be fine with that.
I would add that I don't view these models as necessarily competitive. I view the models as nested, typically hierarchically. And I'm really interested in phenomena that unfold at the micro scale. I put my cards on the table that I think that these kind of paradigms that we do in the lab, where stuff unfolds between 300 and 1200 milliseconds, that's a speeded decision. You can learn a ton about agency there. but you're going to have to aggregate some of that stuff to get things going on at the level of the intentional agent, typically described by folk psychology. But those intentional agents are nested within a social structure, and responsibility is a smeared property that crosses levels. So you draw on different models for different purposes, but you understand that they're all part of a hierarchically structured object under study.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, this is all interesting stuff to point out. I mean, there's also a possible view on which, you know, a less forgiving pluralism, right? Where certain models can be systematically misleading in certain contexts as well.
Right.
At the risk of starting a fight with Robin, I'm sometimes inclined to think that about the standard causal theory of action, that at least as it's interpreted, sometimes in philosophy and sometimes in the mind sciences, it's kind of misleading about the psychology. So we could dive back into that.
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear more on that. Yeah, I am a bit skeptical on like finding the neural realizer, or like, you know, a restricted set of neural realizers. I don't know if that's related to what you're saying now, but I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to insert too much. I just want to, maybe taking Dave's side a little bit. There's a possibility that as the pluralism develops, some models will end up falling by the wayside. So maybe you all weren't as angry about traditional philosophical models as maybe I was hoping you were. But you know, that's fine.
Pluralism doesn't mean nobody's wrong.
Right.
In the martial arts, we say there's many paths up the mountain, but there's lots of paths that don't go up the mountain at all.
Indeed, fall precipitously down the mountain. Yeah.
Bob Kane has convinced me there's more to libertarianism than I thought. And also some of the stuff on neuroscience seems to tend that way too, to the extent that I understand it. But so that might be a case for me where I'd say that model might be less fertile in grounding research programs to the extent it's epistemologically mysterious and so on than other research programs. And then we just have to, you know, we just have to run the research program and see what you buy with it.
Yeah, great. That's a nice point to kind of end at on that point of discussion. So we've already touched on this. I was just going to hopefully push you all for a little bit more detail. When you're thinking philosophically about agency, methodologically, in a sense, how exactly do the neuroscience and psychology findings that you're interested to fit into this? So, you know, there's you could have this view where it's like psychology or neuroscience gives you the facts and you learn the facts and you employ them in your philosophical theorizing. It seems to me that all of you, maybe all of us, if I may include myself, are interested in a more dynamic kind of interplay between those distinct methods and those distinct sources of data. So I was going to ask if you could just take me a little bit deeper about, as you're actively thinking about things, how the sciences and the philosophical aspects interact with each other. Robin, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So both in philosophy of neuroscience and in philosophy of psychiatry, which I do a bit of work in, and really in experimental philosophy, obviously psychology and neuroscience are playing a major role in what I'm doing. I actually began my academic life as an undergraduate in experimental psychology. And I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. So, you know, what happened there is I took some courses in neuroscience and history of theories of cognition, got really into the mind, brain, consciousness questions, and then switched over to philosophy. But I take it that training is really important to what we do as philosophers who are sort of opening up new frontiers in these questions about agency. So, you know, like being trained in experimental methods, statistics, clinical practice, like with the CBT that Chandra's talking about, that really not only sparked my interest in these things, but it also really helps you kind of explore new grounds and new connections. So I take that to be really important. And it seems like too, maybe we'll talk about this later, but increasingly younger scholars are getting more comfortable in and have this expertise in this interdisciplinary space. We can see this, like, I think AI ethics, that's not really our topic today, but is a really great example of this, where it's just like very young, dynamic, interdisciplinary community. People there have got training in machine learning, they've got training in philosophy and ethics, and they're all coming together across industry and academia and really creating something new and answering new questions. So, I want to say this is a good thing. I'm glad we're doing more of it, and I'm glad to see younger scholars getting involved in this way.
Great, yeah, thanks. John, do you want to jump in next?
Well, I think that, so yes to the younger scholars, and I think that when I started thinking about psychology, I had never taken in my philosophical work, I had never taken a psychology course and have still not taken a psychology course. And so definitely made lots of mistakes. Many of us have noticed that some of the early efforts in experimental philosophy were not maximally uplifting in their rigor. And that's to say nothing of, I think I left them behind at WashU, but I used to have boxes and boxes of paper instruments that turned up junk because I thought I was going, it was just easy to wade in and start designing and running studies. And whereas my students and people of subsequent academic generations doing the interdisciplinary work can really do it. They've learned the skills. Maybe they were more acute than I was coming in. I think this is incredibly optimistic for the future, that there's really people, lots of them, and the people on this panel who are legitimately in a position to lead high-level work in both philosophy and the human sciences. And that, I don't think that's in general really true. There are exceptions like Sean Nichols, right? That's not in general true of the people housed in philosophy departments. There's of course brilliant guys like Josh Green who jumped the fence, as it were, and are housed in psychology departments. But so I think it can only get better with all these really, really promising younger researchers with legitimate skill sets season and start teaching students of their own and stuff. So I think really good times ahead.
Well, and also, so this is a nice time to bring Chandra in too, as someone who's kind of leading both lives, as it were. Can you talk about the interplay of these a little bit in your own thinking?
Yeah, I mean, two lives or one complex meshed life. One of the things that should emerge is, one of the things I think about a lot is just thinking and thought. And if you think about how did I start to get obsessed with that issue, when you interact with in the clinical environment, you very quickly start to appreciate the clinical phenomenology, thought content and thought process. Those are, you put that in every single note for a patient. It's called the mental status exam. It actually derives from Carl Jasper's old general psychopathology text. When people interact with patients, you start thinking about their thought process, and how is it that certain kinds of beliefs take hold and so forth. And then in order to answer the questions like that, you need frameworks. There are computational modeling frameworks and neuroscience frameworks that have emerged only in the last 15, 20 years to really flesh out how could you model something like unfolding thought. And I'll mention a interesting study that my lab did recently. We were kind of frustrated with the inability to really characterize unfolding thoughts. We did a talk aloud protocol. 30 minutes, people are in a room, they have no stimulation, and they just say, the instructions are, say whatever is on your mind. And they go to the races right away. People have about 400 thoughts in that 30-minute interval. And we can apply text analytic methods and map thought transitions and link them to personality dimensions. So for an individual high on pessimism and neuroticism, their thought process is as Beck described. You can compute latent semantic scores and calculate the level of negativity in their thought. So what I'm getting at is, the clinical environment, the research environment, the philosophical resources, they can all come together to mutually inform and ask really interesting and answer really interesting questions.
Thanks for all that. I want to actually go off
It was
script
a
a little
mess
bit.
there. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
I want to pause on this because this has really come up at several instances, thinking about whether it be clinical populations or people in morally demanding situations. So Robin's military example, people who are in institutional settings like John's business example. And Dave, I want to bring you into this too, someone who's really thought about instances of borderline responsibility or things that might minimize responsibility in some sense. Can we talk a little bit more about why it's so interesting? I mean, we've hinted at it. Can we talk a little bit more about why it's so interesting to look at these particular kinds of cases for studying agency sort of as a whole? So Dave, you want to start on this?
I'll just say, just very briefly, because I'd like to hear from the others, but one of the aims is to try to figure out so-called standard agency, right? And so one thought has been that you can do that by looking at non-standard agency, and you can find out what's gone wrong, and then see, okay, that tells us something about the capacities that we take to be crucial for standard agency. So that's a standard, that's a nice little methodology. But another is that you quickly realize once you start taking a look at so-called non-standard agency, these are all spectral disorders, and that we're all on various spectra to some extent or another. And so the notion ultimately of there being a standard notion of agency or an ideal notion of agency may be something that none of us fit, or that very notion itself is quite misleading.
Yeah, so I'm really sympathetic to that. I think at least for me, when I'm interested in disorders of agency, I'm really interested in this notion of degrees or qualifications and control and responsibility. And I think when you look at, let's say, for instance, how reasons responsiveness changes over a course of cognitive behavioral therapy or something like that, you can see how agency is on this spectrum and how there are these aspects of agency, and each of those has a spectrum. So in terms of reasons receptivity, reasons reactivity, that's just one example. But that's really what these cases get you. And the same with like sleep deprivation. We can talk about how sense of agency, so taking yourself to be the author of your actions, can weaken say with sleep deprivation, and then talk about the normative implications of that for holding people responsible. Yeah.
John, Chandra, anything you want to add?
I concur.
Yeah. Great.
That's good.
Great, good. Okay, so how is theorizing about this topic different than it was maybe when you began your career? So we've talked a little bit about how the field has evolved a little bit to include more interdisciplinarity. Can you say a little bit more about, for instance, publishing in philosophy in this area? What kind of projects you have taken on that maybe are different than you would have taken on, however, whatever is a relevant time frame ago for you? We've got a few different stage career folks, and also kind of what projects you think are going to be interesting going forward. So if you were to get into the field now, what kind of skills would you want to have? What kind of things would you be looking at? Anyone who wants to kind of chime in on this, I'd be interested in everyone's thoughts on this.
So one thought is that the university system is in general in a state of fairly unhappy flux. 10 years about 100 years old. Will it last another 100 years? You could argue about whether that's good or bad. The presses are better for this. So Oxford has been great. The project we're doing with Princeton. So Monsignor, Boline, Tempio, and Ernie Souza has been pretty sympathetic. But you could put a lot of time in trying to get articles into ethics, which have a serious empirical component, and it might just not be worth it. But one thought here is that the journal system may be in flux too, with so many internet fora like this, and it may not be that necessary. And I think to a certain extent already, the existence of enables people to have a little bit of a freer hand in interdisciplinary work, whereas I think members of all developed disciplines do that, but I think it's gotten a lot better in philosophy, but there's still a lot of rigorous boundary reinforcement. But it's easier to do that through traditional outlets to maintain those boundaries than it is at the internet, where people can set up a blog like Brains and do what they want.
I'll just say, as an associate editor at Ethics, things are changing, but it takes time in a centuries-old institution.
Show me the issues, Shoemaker.
I will happily do that, Doris. But I think one of the main changes has been greater, beyond people being much more willing to engage in interdisciplinary and lots of important empirical work, has been the acceptance of agency and responsibility as a kind of growing subdiscipline in the field. I've seen that happen within the last 15 years, and that's just been a joy.
And I just want to add, we've been talking a lot about interdisciplinary, but on a related note, I think work on naturalistic contexts of agency has really taken off in the last 10 years or so. So we've got, like, books on naturalized free will, like I'm thinking of Deary's book that came out recently on that. But also there's all these rich research pockets of young researchers who are really savvy with the empirical literature on agency, and then they're using that to inform their philosophical accounts of agency. So I'm thinking like people like Shepard and Friedland and Wu and Malopoulos and others, but like there's a lot going on there with kind of reinvigorating naturalized accounts using the interdisciplinary angle.
I'll lend one perspective that, I'm in two disciplines. I have an appointment in psychiatry, I have an appointment in philosophy, and tenured in both. And so I see the intellectual climate in the two places, and I've seen it unfold. God, I'm getting old. I mean, I've seen 15 years of this at this point. And I'll give philosophy a big shout out. My experience over the years has been, you can spend some time in psychiatry, you can be in psychology, you can spend some time with collaborators in statistics or computer science, and the narrowing is appreciable when you start to walk into the building. And philosophy just really stands out as encompassing everything else that goes on campus, at their foundations, at their most abstract, at their most interesting points. So that's been that way since I joined philosophy, and it's been that way continuing since then. So there's an observation, a kind of a pat on the back for the field. Philosophy is doing, it really still encompasses the big and the great questions.
So as long as we're patting philosophy on the back, one observation I will make, since I've been doing it, when I started, it was mandatory that any paper that you did that was interdisciplinary had to have a section more or less refuting more, right? Or there had to be this metaphilosophical bit about why it's okay to be a naturalist, the kind of naturalist who takes scientific facts seriously. More in ethics, it's not always been that way in the philosophy of science. But I still get referee reports like that. Well, some people don't think the facts matter, but as a general presumption, I do think the sense isn't really concrete, but there's just a feel that you don't have to defend that all the time, that you can go out and do some work. And it was absolutely not that way for the first generation of interdisciplinary moral psychologists, where it was constantly getting in fights about methodology. And I say, oh, you do that, you're one of those, right? And it's more okay. And so I think, who knows what it will look like in 10 years. But for now, I think that is freeing for younger researchers and stuff to not really, we have to get into the naturalistic fallacy from 1934 to do the work we want to do.
That's a good point. The open doors we see now were opened by some folks over the decades. Yeah, so many thanks to them, including you, John. Not that your decades.
Well,
let's leave it at that.
That's necessary to report.
This seems like so I was having a similar conversation in the last roundtable, and it seems like a good time to put in something that actually Ned Block was saying, who I also think is one of those figures. And he was really touting the importance of philosophy as a skill set. So even as we become more interdisciplinary, right, that we retain certain of the kind of focus on conceptual clarity and argumentative precision that is what part of what makes philosophy kind of methodologically great, and allows it to interact with all of those different fields in productive ways. So I take it we probably wouldn't disagree with that, but it seemed like a worthwhile point to insert as we embrace interdisciplinarity and being seen across campus and so forth. So great, yeah, thanks. Okay, so I want to move on to one last kind of big topic, and that topic is, how should we think about philosophical understanding of agency and the actual world, right? So public issues, political issues, issues in, for instance, public health, it seems like, are really relevant to many of the topics that we've been talking about. So I want to be kind of broad about this. I've noticed that each of you, in your own ways, has done some kind of like public philosophy a little bit. What role can philosophy play in actively engaging with public issues of our time? So I don't. If anyone wants to start out with this, Robin, I know, for instance, you've done some interviews recently about agency.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So I've recently done an interview with the Free Will Show podcast, which is a really fantastic podcast series, interviews philosophers and also neuroscientists and psychologists about free will. But I've done some public philosophy beyond that as well, with Scientific American, and I've written a report for the John Templeton Foundation on their work on free will, which they distribute to journalists. But I mean, it goes broader than that, right? So I feel like for me, public philosophy was sort of the way during the pandemic I reached out beyond my isolated house and kind of continued philosophy discussions with others. That's really how I got into it. I regularly contribute to the Monday magazine on 3 Quarks Daily, and there it was really important to me that I take sort of this focus I have in academia on control and agency and responsibility, and I try to extend that to current events. Because I think that connection is always there, and as philosophers and academics, we're always interested in that connection, but we don't always, go out to that broader audience and talk about it. So, so much that you can talk about, right? So there's neurotechnology like Neuralink that people are interested in. There's polarized moral stands that other people here are more qualified to talk about than me. Moral anger among the, citizens. I really think, our work here in agency and responsibility can illuminate the nature of that social phenomenon and that human nature that is just in real time unfolding. So I really like this idea of using public philosophy as an indicator that, kind of as Chandra was saying, our discipline isn't some esoteric, out of touch practice, right? It's a living activity. It can shed light on human nature, and it can do so in real time. And I love that about public philosophy. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's a great kind of motivation for getting involved in things beyond sort of
Yeah.
our departmental doorways. Actually, John, I want to go to you as well. So can you say a little bit about being involved in a business school as a philosopher, sort of what you take the benefit of that to be? Is it of, primarily theoretical interest, or do you want to have an effect on how institutions think about themselves? Can you say a little bit more about your motivations there?
Well, so the specific subset or subgroup I'm in is management and organizations. And I think for the people who know the kind of work I fooled around with, a lot of the theoretical literature in management and organizations looks kind of like empirically informed moral psychology. So one of the classics is by a Michigan guy, Carl Weick, The Collapse of Sense Making in Organizations. And it's about a wildland firefighting disaster. And so sort of what went wrong is the sort of group broke down. And so there's a whole literature, and I taught a seminar on failure, and there's a whole literature on the various ways organizations break down. This is not to speak to the public philosophy question, but it does seem to me that there's a tremendously rich set of problems that people think about in management and organizations that all of us who do moral psychology would recognize the kinds of problems we think we can offer insights on or get insights from. So substantively, I think there's a lot of stuff there. And in fact, if you look at the, I didn't know this when I came to Cornell, I knew we were going to have great moral psychology and philosophy, but on this might be worth talking about, but we launched the world, so far as I know, the world's first moral psychology minor, which does have a public facing engaged component. So they have to go out in the world to finish the major and work for a local nonprofit. But the executive committee for the major is drawn from all over the university, and there's tons of people, Simone Tang and Angus Hildreth, all through the business school, who do what we would recognize as moral psychology.
Yeah, great. Yeah, go ahead, Chandra.
Yeah, I'll lend my own perspective about public engagement by philosophers. I think it's essential. And I'll give some personal experiences that speak to that. So, I work with addiction clinics that treat addiction. And those are busy clinics these days. The opioid crisis has exploded, and there are clinicians that are interacting with patients, and there's a DSM criteria for addiction, and people know that addiction involves excessive use despite the deleterious consequences, difficulty cutting down, and certain physiological parameters being met. There are practical questions that families want to know about: is this person under control? Did they wreck my family volitionally? Or, these are some questions. Clinicians are not going to address these questions. They are going to read the latest journal about what pharmacological intervention helps under this situation. They're going to apply for grants. The NIH is not going to pay for a grant about what is the nature of control, when is somebody responsible, and things like that. These are questions that are dangling there, and they are central and they're important. They actually change the trajectory of research. I mean, it used to be that you could say addiction is a brain disorder that involves compulsive use. It's getting harder and harder to say that. And philosophers played a role in that. Hannah Picard's wonderful series of papers and work on choice in addiction, and the role of folk psychological constructs like denial in addiction. I mean, these are widely cited papers and people know about them. So this is an example. I mean, what I'm saying then is that clinicians have a hugely important role to play in addiction, but they're not going to answer some very central questions that we have about it, of very practical importance. And so philosophers need to be doing that.
Yeah, I think that's great. Thinking of it as an opportunity, as a place where philosophers' skill sets can be valuable in sort of public life, I think is a really nice way to think about it. Dave, qua editor of Pea Soup, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there is, this may not be Kwasup response, but I mean, I think Hannah's a great example of a work that has become really informative in the public square, but and for clinicians, and she's a clinician as well, and so is able to speak that language and comes from a place of great understanding. But I don't want to discount the value of what I think of as trickle-down philosophy, so that there are people doing very high-level abstract theoretical work that does find its way into the public square and kind of assumptions that people have. But I also think there's great value in speaking directly to the square, as Chandra was referring to. I mean, I've thought along the lines that he was talking about that. And I think in terms of moral emotions and kind of moral psychology, and I had been thinking about caregivers of people with various kinds of, who are so caring for people on the margins of agency, and they often feel terrible for the way in which they react. They react in a responsibility way towards their charges, or they can't help but get angry, say, at the patient, at their loved one they're taking care of with dementia. And so there was part of what I've been trying to do is speak to them and say you have good reasons for the responses that you have, and there are reasons that you might not want to be responding in this other sort of way. So it's kind of vindication, maybe, was what I was after a bit for some actual caregivers of people on the margins. But I guess that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's a nice place to kind of summarize that, right? So going back to the pluralism discussion from earlier, there's a range of philosophical projects one could take on, more abstract or more scientifically oriented, more abstract or more public facing. And I think there's an argument for such a complex issue of being kind of wide net about it and trying to integrate over a lot of different perspectives and types of project. And I think we've had a really good layout of those kinds of, or some subset of those kinds of projects today. So we could talk all day about this, but I think we're going to have to come to an end. I really want to thank all of you for joining today. I found this to be a really fascinating and really fun discussion. And this is still the experimental stage, if I'm going to admit, with the Brains Blog Roundtable. So I really enjoyed this, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, and we look forward to posting this on the Brains blog and on Pea Soup as well.
Definitely. Thank you.
Thanks,
Oh,
Elizabeth.
Great
Everyone.
discussion. Thank you, Dan.
All right, thanks you all. And
Yeah,
thank you all
everybody.
for joining us, and stay tuned for future iterations of Brains blog roundtables.